Welcome to Milestone Moments, the show where we explore the journeys that lead to success. I'm Sheila Slick, your host and founder of 5 Milestones. In every episode, we will bring you insights from the minds of entrepreneurs, leaders, and experts who will share not just their expertise, but the milestone moments that have reshaped their journeys and led to significant achievements. So if you're looking for motivation, you're in the right place. Subscribe now and discover the milestones that mark the path to success. Welcome to another episode of Milestone Moments in Business and Leadership. I'm your host, Sheila Slick, and today my special guest is Dr. Alena Candova. Dr. Candova is a subconscious transformation specialist, a neurocoach, and author of Grace Over Grit. She helps high-achieving, purpose-driven individuals resolve the subconscious patterns and nervous system responses that shape how they lead, relate, and pursue success. Welcome to the show, Alena.
Thank you so much for having me, Sheila.
So, Alena, before we learn about what you do today, take me back to that version of your life. What were you building? What did success look like before you realized that something was off?
Yeah, and that's a great question. Reflecting back, I wasn't really building anything that was aligned with what I'm here to do or what I was born to do. I was pushing myself to feel good about the external outcomes. I left my country as soon as I could. I was 18, I packed my bags, and I convinced myself that I was just going to go abroad and learn English. And then as soon as I got to London, I realized the freedom that I started to feel not being in the environment of my childhood conditioning and upbringing, being away that has given me. And so I I pushed. I pushed for jobs, I pushed in toxic relationships. I was pushing myself to endure the discomfort that all these life experiences were bringing me. I would be in jobs that I really didn't like, but it was paying money and I felt like I was doing better than anyone else at home because I was living abroad and I was free. And suddenly, for someone that was born in a small Czech village, is working in a corporate firm in London, in an office, that was something that appeared really big and important to me. And so I didn't know it at the time. I lived convincing myself that, my jobs were fine, my relationships, although they were toxic, I convinced myself they were fine because that's what I believed at the time. Because a lot of the times we end up living lives that don't fully align with our highest truth. And to be able to move through life in that way, we lie to ourselves. Denial has a very valid role in our lives. It keeps us safe before we actually get to a place within ourselves in which we can start acknowledging the misalignment and in which we can start actually acknowledging that some of these old programs at our subconscious level are no longer actually helping us as they once did. Although I was thriving in workplace, I had great colleagues. I pushed myself to enjoy things that I would not do now. And that's part of the youth too. When we're younger, we adapt more easier to what society expects from us. So that's another part of this deception that we end up living with. But it's part of our inner process. But where I wasn't thriving, and when I was still convincing myself that I was thriving, was my relationships. Because I kept calling in these toxic relationships and I kept settling and I kept pushing through the discomfort of that. And, that took some years. And at the end of the last of these toxic relationships, I felt so broken. I started to realize I need to do something for myself or with myself. And that's when I really started my spiritual journey. And a lot of the first years, I really didn't understand what I was looking for or what I was trying to do. I was just trying to feel better. I was just trying to heal a lot of that pain that came from that last relationship. And so I got into yoga and I started to meditate. And it took some years before I found myself in Bali. And this is in my early 30s. And I felt like I had enough courage to go and sit in a week-long silent meditation retreat. And so there I am, totally convinced that now I am, on my path, and I've been practicing yoga and I've been meditating, and I'm in a much better relationship at this stage. I am living in Spain. I'm thinking my life is really wonderful. It was really interesting because the way they structured the retreat was that in the first 3 days, they led us to send loving compassion to people around us. So the day one was sending love and compassion to our families. On the second day, we were sending loving compassion to our friends. On the third day, we were sending loving compassion to people that hurt us. And I remember sitting there going, oh my gosh, this is so easy, like I'm really, like, I'm good. And on the day 4, they guided us to send loving compassion to ourselves. And I still get goosebumps as I remember that, right? Because I got overtaken by this feeling of, I can't do it, which followed confusion because my conscious mind believed that I loved myself. And so I sat there and I couldn't understand why there was so much internal resistance. And it felt so overwhelming and it felt so painful. It broke me. I cried, and then I realized that everyone, the other 50 people in a room, were in the same position. And it was really shocking experience, to realize that I have been lying to myself most of my life and I have been pushing so hard. Then that moment also made me realize that I have been pushing even on the yoga mat. In a part of my spiritual practice, I pushed myself so far that when I went to India to improve my practice, my physical body locked so much because I was forcing so much. And so that Bali retreat really, really shook my core and had me reflect on a totally different level. And what was really difficult as well was that as we ended that retreat, no one told us what to do with those realizations. So I went home, and as I started to integrate back into my life, I did what I knew. I disassociated from feeling all that stifled pain and that disconnection from myself. And I went back into working through logic and willpower and discipline. And then that took me, again, another couple of years to, in my case, I consider myself lucky enough to be introduced to psychedelic therapy, which then really pushed me through that door of the inner resistance. And I found myself really feeling all that love that's always been there and all that deep compassion and understanding that's always been there, but it's been stifled by my programming. And so, that very experience then tied into that meditation experience, and it had me really want to understand, how can we open those doors to our subconscious, to that very programming that's actually driving up to 95% of our lives, that's created these false identities we identify with. And how can we start opening those doors that are so guarded with these overwhelming feelings and start to deconstruct these limiting beliefs and this conditioning that we have about ourselves and life.
I have a few questions. So the first one, the one in Bali, was a silent retreat. So a silent retreat, in my mind, if I can envision it, you're just quiet for 5 days.
It was a silent retreat, and it wasn't completely silent because every morning at 4:30 we would start to sit, and there would be guidance. And so they would guide us to send that love and compassion to others and then eventually to ourselves. And then for the rest of the day, we would sit in silence. We couldn't speak, we couldn't journal, right? We just had to sit with ourselves, which, as you can imagine, is initially physically uncomfortable because not a lot of people are able to sit for that long without moving. But then as we get over or surrender to that physical discomfort, we start touching on the deeper things within ourselves. And that was that day 4. Essence, they prepared us for those 3 days, just allowing our nervous system to settle, allowing our mind to settle, was nearly like a tease. Well, giving love to everyone else is easy thing to do for all of us. And so, yeah, we couldn't talk, we couldn't write, we just had to sit with ourselves. There were people that found it a little easier to go through the process, but then there were also people that at the end of the retreat, when there was a moment to share our experiences the day before we left, there were people that would say that they counted the tiles in a room and they counted the meditation cushions. They were doing the very thing so many of us do when it comes to escaping or avoiding our subconscious programs, right? Like we distract ourselves. They would look out into the trees out of the window, they would count how many birds flew by. It was that kind of distraction that happens for all of us in everyday life by overworking, by, in my case, even over exercising.
At that moment in time, what was your career? Were you there as a participant or was this something that was part of your profession?
At that moment, I was participating, yes. It was actually in the early years of being in a chiropractic college. So I started chiropractic college in my early 30s. I waited all that time from my parents saying, you don't have the brain to be a doctor or study. It took me all these years. I was in my early 30s and I said, no, actually, I can do this. And so every single summer when the college was closed, I would dedicate the 2.5, 3 months to finding myself. And I would go to Bali and I would practice yoga, meditation. I would do all these retreats because I knew that although my life then was much better, I was no longer in a toxic relationship and I was moving towards a career that I thought was gonna be 100% fulfilling. I still intuitively, I wouldn't be able to put language to it, but I still intuitively knew that I needed to continue to look deeper and see what else I can find. And then I found this huge thing. Then I wouldn't have believed if someone told me, you're going to go over there, you're going to find that you don't love yourself and you are living life based on that. I would have laughed at them, Sheila. I would say, no, this is not possible.
So after that experience, you went looking for answers and then said that many of your approaches were incomplete. The ones that you found were incomplete. What was that actually like? And what kept you going when nothing was fitting together yet?
I kept searching and I kept also, I'm a very intuitive person. I've always been, although I didn't understand that initially. And so as I continued to search, I would find that, a lot of the approaches that I would try work for a little bit. And so I would just stop and I would look for something else because I wasn't fully feeling that I was truly being helped and the deeper level at which I was looking help for, because I touched those deeper layers in both in that meditation and through the psychedelic experience. And so I continued to look and I continued to do my inner work the way I knew, right? Self-reflection, meditation. I started this practice in a way a lot of my early inner work was done on my own with this exploration of other modalities, which, of course, did their magic on me because everything comes in the right place and does what we're ready for it to do. But I always felt something was missing. And so as I started seeing clients, because I also had a background in yoga and yoga therapy and massage therapy, as I graduated and I started seeing clients, um, and that was actually another interesting milestone, because at least in Europe, when people graduate chiropractic college, the standard thing is to go and work with a chiropractor that has an established practice, so we can learn and continue to develop skills and business skills. And so it was really interesting to watch that in a conflict, and now in retrospect look back at that time, because already in a chiropractic clinic, in a student clinic, I was seeing things that other people weren't seeing in my patients. I was seeing, well, this patient doesn't exactly need structural adjustment because there is some emotional component to their well-being. And I did all these extracurricular seminars while I was still studying. And so the day I graduated, this big question hit me. And I got really confused because everyone was going to work with a chiropractor. And I didn't have anything like that lined up, because I didn't have anyone that I felt like I wanted to truly learn from, because I was going to all these, extracurricular realms of subconscious work and emotional resolution. And so there was a big part of me that really wanted to continue and honor that inner calling, but there was also a part of me that was afraid and wanted to do the safe thing. And so there was a morning I woke up and I sat up in my bed and I thought, just go and work with a chiropractor. You can, learn, and you can leave anytime. Just go and get the experience. That very moment I got such a bad vertigo, I couldn't even stand up. It was like universe was redirecting me, saying, this is not what are you doing. You cannot do things out of fear in life, right? So I sat with it. I took a deep breath and I said, okay, I'm listening. This is a message. I am gonna figure it out. And so as I started my own practice and I started to see people, a lot of people with chronic illness would come and see me. It wasn't like the typical client for a chiropractor, back pain, neck pain. It was like hormonal issues, infertility, a lot of chronic illness. And I realized that when we lift that emotional charge of unprocessed past experiences, the body started to heal. And so they were healing, they were feeling better, but they were still repeating the same patterns that were limiting them in their careers, in their relationships. And so that got me really interested in going deeper, because then I thought to myself, well, here you are using fraction of a modality that helps one part of the system, but doesn't actually help the person as a whole. And so when I started to see that, I, at the same time, was already well along my own healing path and started to live the life that was so much more expansive than I could ever imagine. And of course, I started to want that for my clients. I started to question what was missing for me and what's missing for my clients that would allow them to actually work with their own system outside of my office, because a big part of our growth happens outside of a therapist office. What's missing so they can actually become their own guides and they can be empowered and they can learn how to work with these deeper structures of their psyche. And I started to build a program which actually, as I reflect on it out loud with you, it built itself first. And then I was just watching the pieces. Okay, this is what I've been doing. I've been doing this, and I've been doing this, and I've been doing this. And then I brought it all together into a more structured, comprehensive way that people could follow. And then I started basically seeing people only in a way of programs. So the program was born from this process.
And this is the grace over grit method?
This is the grace over grit method, yes.
So I want to learn more. The grace over grit method brings together neuroscience, nervous system work, somatic awareness, and subconscious reprogramming. So can you explain what all this means and the thread that connects it all?
Yes. So maybe we should speak, or I should speak more to the grace over grit first. The name continued to come up so strongly, I just surrendered and I said, it is grace over grit, because it kept hanging over. And there was a part of me that's like, that's not very business-like, like I continue to get confused by my logical mind. And the reason why it came through so strongly was because I started to realize, in reflecting on my own journey and also looking at all of these journeys of my clients, that we push too much. We try to work on these neurologically wired patterns of our childhood with logic and willpower. While if we look at it from a neuroscientific perspective, our brain, the prefrontal cortex that we use to logic and reason, wasn't developed when we were children. So it absolutely doesn't make any sense to start to first address all of our issues with logic and willpower, because there is a disconnection. And so as I build this program, I felt like when we actually understand how this developmental subconscious wiring happens from our early childhood and have the steps to work with it, we no longer have to work with grit, but we can now start working with grace, which is what actually allows for the rewiring to happen. And so it combines neuroscience. In this case, it's applied neuroscience. How can we use the understanding and the tools that understand how the brain works, how it drives behavioral patterns in an application in personal development and growth? Part of this model embodies somatic work, because somatic work is such a huge part of the rewiring of our subconscious patterns and these outdated identities, because as I just mentioned, our prefrontal cortex, our logical brain, wasn't developed. So everything was happening in the body. Soma is a Latin word for body. So that embodied work is very, really huge part of it. Because as children, if you think about going through experiences as children, we feel everything very acutely. We may not understand what life is about, right? Like for someone that is excited the whole day for when dad comes home from work so they can play, and then dad comes home and dad had a very busy and stressful day and he's burned out and he just want to sit on a sofa and he's kind of withdrawn, that little human is going to take it on themselves and say, well, maybe I did something wrong because this doesn't make sense. Dad doesn't want to play with me. They don't understand possibly that, that reasoning doesn't exist. So they feel this activation, there's been excitement, and now there is an overwhelm of disappointment maybe. And they then put a meaning to it. And the meaning is often distorted. And in this case is, dad doesn't love me, or I'm not good enough for him to play with me. And so we have to learn to get in contact with those somatic experiences so we can rewire the meaning of them. But for so many of us, and myself included, it's really difficult to get in touch with these parts of ourselves because they feel as overwhelming as they felt in our childhood. So they feel they feel big, they feel unsafe in our body. And so what I started to notice, and that's why I brought applied neuroscience into this method, is that when people actually understand what that overwhelming activation is, then it becomes easier to work with it and it becomes easier to lean into it. And when they understand that for them to be able to lean into it, they have to cultivate capacity at their level of their nervous system, then they also more likely to commit to those nervous system regulation practices than do what so many high achievers are doing these days. I'm seeing there is so much more awareness about nervous system regulation, but it's only in the moments of stress. So they basically using it as a band-aid, do a deep breathing to calm yourself down. And in that moment, of course, it's going to work. It's going to help you execute that presentation, for example. But if you don't do it in a comprehensive way of understanding that wiring and holding space for that activation instead of stifling it with that breathing technique so you can push forward, then we just reinforcing that pattern. And so I was seeing all of these pieces and I was seeing all of these beautiful modalities and approaches. And I just knew that I needed to bring it together for people to be able to get to the place where they have deeper understanding. Oh, this is what my system is doing now. This is what's happening. And this is what I can do to rewire it with grace, with compassion, rather than willpower.
So, who benefits from it? Who do you serve? And where can they find your work online or find your book as well?
I will work with anyone that really wants to dive deep and do the deep inner work. Most of my clients are people that have already done personal development work and they are, they gotten to a certain level of self-awareness, but life's still not as fulfilling as they know it could be. There's still these bumps on the road. And so I mainly work with these people, high achievers, of course, because that's basically my avatar. And I support people in two different ways. If people are not ready to dive in with me as the person that sees their blind spots and can accelerate the growth, and they want to go through self-guided online program, I have an online program for them that has the whole structure of the Grace Over Grid that they would do if they sit with me. There's a inner workbook that goes with it. They'll get the meditations and all the guidance and education is there. Or they can take the full program and alongside of this online program have my guidance that helps them fully break through the patterns that are so difficult for us to access on their own because we've built those walls ourselves. It's not impossible, but it's much easier, obviously, to get to these patterns with someone that can act as a neutral observer.
And for those tuning in today, what do you want them to take away from our conversation?
All of these limiting patterns you may be dealing with, whether it's in relationship or in your career, your self-worth, were born to protect you. Okay, the early adaptations mostly from the childhood that were created so you could feel that you fit in, that you are accepted, that you are loved. So see if you can change your relationship with them and start to see them as the protectors that they are and start to get curious about them rather than trying to destroy them, right? Like start to ask questions of a type, what are you trying to protect me from? Why are you here? What needs to change instead of you are destroying my life and I want to get rid of you. We often look at these limitations as something very negative. And so the first step is to understand that those limitations are not your identity. They're just a protective pattern at the level of your nervous system. And so every moment your nervous system expresses that pattern, it means that it's deeming that you are not safe. It's just shifted into a protective mode and it's deeming you are not safe. So what can you do to show your nervous system that you are actually safe? And a lot of the times that starts with self-compassion, right? And just understanding that there is a part of me that is not feeling safe yet to expand into the greatness that I am and I can experience in life.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, thank you for having me. It was an absolute pleasure.
Thank you for tuning in today. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you have a story of your own that you'd like to share or have ever thought about becoming a published author, visit 5milestones.com to be a guest on the show. One conversation is all it takes to become a published author. You have a story that matters. It's time to tell it.